One of the areas of the United States that's going to see a gradual change is the southern portion of the country. After the Civil War that ended in 1865, the Southerners took part in what was called the Lost Cause. Many Southerners found comfort in the nostalgia of the Old South after the Civil War, the idea of living on a plantation, the idea of the way things used to be. But there were other individuals that pushed for a new South. One of these individuals was Henry Woodvin Grady. He was the editor of the Atlanta Constitution, and he said the Old South was dead, but a new South of union and freedom was growing every hour of every day. And so he's pushing for this idea of a new South that is becoming more industrialized and is catching up to the northern part of the country. And we will see some new industry in the South. One industry in particular was the textile industry. Cotton mills are going to grow tremendously. They grew from only 161 in 1880 to 400 cotton mills by the year 1900. And one of the things about cotton mills, though, at the time is 70% of the mill workers were under the age of 21, and many of them were child laborers. They were under the age of 14, and it was a very tough industry to work in. They worked from dawn to dusk for around 50 cents a day. There were horrific working conditions. There was no health and safety measures put in place at the time. Children were liked to be used for these types of jobs because they were small, because they had small hands, because they could fit under these machines that you could see pictured here to fix them if there was an issue. Keep in mind at the time there were no safety measures in place. There was no emergency shut-off button. There's going to be many injuries that are going to happen within these cotton mills. Another area of the South that's going to see an increase is coal production. Coal production increases from 1875 from 5 million tons to over 49 million tons by the year 1900. So that's going to be another industry that increased in southern states. And we're also going to see an increase in lumber production in areas such as Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina. The lumber industry is going to increase tremendously. Another new term that's going to come about in the South in the late 1800s is the crop lien system. This is developed in southern states, and a lot of southern farmers were unable to afford the goods that they needed, or even the seeds and fertilizers that they needed to grow their crops. So what would happen is a merchant would provide food, clothing, seed, fertilizers, any other item that a farmer might need on credit. And in exchange, when the growing season was over, the farmer would give that merchant a share of their crops when they harvest them. So a lot of poor farmers are not able to really get ahead. A portion of their crop is going to go to the merchant that provided them with the goods that they needed, and they'll have just enough for themselves to live off of. So it's a good system, and it's a bad system at the same time. It helps these poor farmers survive, though. Race relations in the South are going to continue to get worse. Race relations in especially the 1890s get relatively worse. White farmers and politicians are going to start to demand that blacks have voting rights and civil rights taken away in the southern states, even though there are amendments to the United States Constitution that prevents this. So one of the southern states that comes up with a plan is Mississippi. And the Mississippi plan, they create a series of amendments to the Mississippi State Constitution that do not necessarily violate the U.S. Constitution at the time. So many African Americans moved around a lot after the Civil War as they were trying to move to areas that were safer or where there were jobs. So the Mississippi plan comes up with this plan to kind of prevent African Americans from voting. So if you wanted to vote, you had to be a resident of the area for 2 years. So if you're moving around a lot, you're not allowed to vote then. Blacks couldn't vote if they committed certain crimes, and this was only specific to African Americans. You had to have your taxes paid in full, including a poll tax. So you had to pay a tax if you wanted to vote. Most African Americans and poor whites at the time could not afford this, as well as many immigrants. All voters needed to be able to read and understand the U.S. Constitution. And if all those rules didn't make it so you couldn't vote, the last one was a grandfather clause. Your grandfather had to have voted in the 1860 election, which slavery was still intact at the time. So what's going to happen is the number of African American voters is going to be cut tremendously by these laws that are created. So in 1896, there was 130,000 Black voters in Louisiana. With new state laws that they created by 1900, only 5,320 were able to vote. And there's going to be other laws and court rulings that are going to take away rights from African Americans. In 1883, the Supreme Court is going to rule the Civil Rights Act of 1875 as unconstitutional. The court's going to say that the 13th and 14th Amendments did not give Congress authority to pass laws dealing with racial discrimination by private citizens or businesses. So it could only deal with the government. Individuals and businesses were allowed to engage in racial discrimination because the 14th Amendment stated that only no state could deny citizens equal protection under the law. So it didn't say that individuals couldn't deny it. It didn't say that businesses couldn't deny it. So this allowed for racial discrimination. And a very good example of racial discrimination is the court case of Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. And pictured here, you'll see Homer Adolph Plessy. He's only 1/8 African American and 7/8 white. So he is going to refuse to leave the whites only section of a railroad car in Louisiana. He identified as being white. He was 7/8 white. At the time, there were white-only sections and black-only sections on railroad cars. He's going to be convicted of violating Louisiana state law by refusing to leave the whites-only section. This court case is going to go all the ways to the United States Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court is going to rule that states had the right to create segregation laws for public places as long as they had equal facilities. So they could have a blacks-only waiting room, a blacks and whites-only bathroom, drinking fountain, schools, railroad cars. So what this is called is the separate but equal clause. The problem is that all of these facilities usually were not equal. So what this is going to create is Jim Crow laws, especially throughout the South, where there's going to be white-only businesses and colored-only businesses and sections. So there'll be white and black-only hotels, companies that will only service whites or blacks. So it segregates the entire South. And what's going to happen is violence in the South is going to increase tremendously. Between 1890 and 1899, the U.S. averaged 188 racial lynchings per year. 82% of these lynchings are going to take place in the South. And there's going to be individuals that are going to fight for more rights for African Americans throughout the country. One of these individuals is Ida B. Wells. And Ida B. Wells, she was born into slavery. When slavery ends, she is going to attend school and move to Memphis, Tennessee. She's going to be a teacher in segregated schools. And she's going to end up being an individual that's going to fight for civil rights for African Americans. In 1883, she's going to lose her seat on a railroad car because she was black, and she's going to sue the court, and the circuit court is going to rule in her favor. The Supreme Court actually overturns the ruling. She ends up becoming an editor for the Memphis Free Speech newspaper, and while she's editor of the paper, 3 of her friends are going to be lynched, and that's when she's going to start crusading against lynching throughout the country. She's going to be one of the individuals that starts the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. Booker T. Washington is going to be another individual that is going to help African Americans. He's born into slavery in 1856. He had a black mother and a white father. He is going to enroll in the Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute at the age of 16. He is going to be the protege of the school founder, Samuel Chapman Armstrong. It's going to be Armstrong who later recommends Booker T. Washington for the president position at the Tuskegee Institute. And Booker T. Washington, his message to students was that they needed to gain practical knowledge. And he did a lot to please the white donors of the school. So he would argue that blacks shouldn't focus on fighting racial segregation. They needed to focus on hard work and self-improvement first and worry about fighting racial segregation later. And so an individual that completely did not agree with Booker T. Washington, and they both did not get along, is W.E.B. Du Bois. So Washington and Du Bois did not get along at all. Du Bois is a native of Massachusetts. He doesn't really experience prejudice or racial issues until he's a student at Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. So he comes to the South. He's the first African American to receive a doctoral degree from Harvard University. He writes more than 20 books, and like I said, he's a strong opponent against Booker T. Washington. And Du Bois, he wrote several books. One of his most famous is The Souls of Black Folk. And the book is going to highlight the double life that's felt by African Americans. He felt, as an African American, that most African Americans felt that they were American and black. They had 2 different souls. They had to act 2 different ways. And so an African American would reveal one self to his own people and another self that he would show to whites. And that's what he focuses on in this book.